So here we can see a bunch of wheels. There's wooden ones, a big stone one, wheels without tires, with tires, spokes, no spokes. Until moderately recently, we generally thought the wheel was invented around 4000 BCE in Mesopotamia. But some recent evidence makes us think it was more like 4500 BCE in Ukraine, of all places. But regardless of where it was invented, what is agreed upon is that they weren't actually used for transport. They were instead used as potter's wheels and water wheels and tools, really. So now just at this conference, the last 1.5 days, I've heard probably 3 times someone say, don't reinvent the wheel. And I'm going to call bullshit on that. Where would we be now if all we had was a round rock to help us make pots? We've spent at least 6,724 years reinventing the wheel. And now we've got trains, electric unicycles, and office chairs that you can roll back and forth on while your code compiles, right? So I think sometimes software is like the wheel. Just because it works fine for now, it's not necessarily for purpose in the future, and it can always be improved. So 2 years ago, my team shifted from Ruby to Elixir, and there was a great talk yesterday about managing that shift. But I'm going to focus more today on the particular problem that we faced, which was rebuilding and recreating a bunch of internal tools that, were kind of just par for the course in the company at the time. And instead of treating it like a speed bump or a hurdle, we decided to see it as an opportunity. So let's talk about reinventing the wheel. If anyone is a fantasy fan, they may notice my Wheel of Time quotes over the course of the slides. But yeah, a little bit of history first. I'm Dylan, as you heard from Zappi, and we automate market research, so respondent sourcing, data collection, data analysis, and we've been, Rails for the majority of the company life. We also, as everyone was doing around 2018, we're moving all our front end to a React SBA, because of course you were. And I joined specifically in the data analytics space, so automating, modeling, visualization, etc. So we could provide users actionable insights. But as the years went on, we started making major shifts, both technically and in the product space. Technically, time goes on and you notice application bloat, development slowdown, local environment difficulties, all that usual stuff. Maybe a little bit too late to the party, we jumped on the microservices ship because obviously it would solve every problem that we had. And I was personally involved in some of our next step architecture changes. We built a little gem which wrapped SQS and SNS to facilitate event-driven architectures. And my team built the first microservice that had a dedicated GraphQL and micro front end. So in some parts of the system, these kind of changes did help. We had one application which was really a bunch of different domains, and they were quite clearly separated. Once we investigated them, we found clear domain boundaries, so it was easy enough to split things out into services and move on. Reports, the analysis application, was not quite so easy because it turns out data analysis is actually just a really complex field. There were lots of moving parts. We couldn't separate them out as easily, so we needed to do something a bit more drastic than that. And at the same time, we were having a very big product shift in the company. We were finding that, our approach to providing users insights or numbers was just give them all the tools they need to interrogate their data, provide them a bunch of different options, let them do what they want. Turns out most market researchers don't know what they want, so they were provided with all these options and they're unable to do anything. So our product was shifting towards much more of a simplicity model. Figure out actually what the customer needs and give that to them. So yeah, all these shifts, technical and product, we needed to do something pretty drastic, like potentially rebuild the reporting platform from scratch with an entirely new product vision. Luckily, I didn't have to make that decision. It was my CTO, and he's not sure whether he regrets it yet. I was tasked with leading the first team that got split out to try and rewrite and really simplify the deliverable that we gave customers. And when you're given that freedom to start from scratch, why not go big? Why not use an entirely new language? Our CTO has been a massive fan of Elixir for a long while now, so he was plugging it hard. And we weren't actually the first team to use Elixir in the company. It just hadn't really been adopted after the first Elixir app was built. What that did mean, though, because there was a precedent for someone building an Elixir app, we had a few things in place. So we had a deployment pipeline, we had a little bit of Elixir knowledge within the company, and we had some code we could copy and paste, particularly a one login like XML parser thing, so that we could, at the bare minimum, restrict access to internal users to whatever application we were building. But I still needed to justify to myself, the company, the team, why we should use Elixir. I could say that it was the concurrency model or OTP, functional programming, data immutability, all the buzzwords, all the nice things. That would be a lie. I wanted to try something fun. I wanted to try something new. Looking back now, I could provide good reasons to move to Elixir, but at the time, it was just cool. So really what I had to prove was that it wouldn't slow us down. Given we were a small team, we needed to choose something that would allow us to move fast, but more importantly, not slow down as time went on. So that probably meant choosing something a bit more high level, something garbage collected. I've used C++, but I don't really want to go back there. And we were all web developers. We almost went with Python because we'd all touched it. We knew the syntax. But I read this obscure book, you might have heard about it, called Elixir in Action. And I fell in love. I fell in love after that. I knew I had to convince people. I knew that's what we had to go with. I still couldn't justify why we did have to go with it, but I was fairly certain for the most part that it wouldn't dramatically slow us down in terms of learning a new language. Except, like you might assume, the internal dependencies. Like I'm assuming most fairly mature companies, we had a bunch of them. Since everything was Rails, they were gems hosted on a little private gem server. The most important one was the user management connector, which, as the name implies, connected to the user management service. And that dealt with everything user, organizations, authentication, authorization, all that stuff. The issue was that because everything was Rails and we had this gem to connect us to the service, the API was not particularly good. All of the logic, all of the good stuff was wrapped up inside the gem. And there were good reasons for it at the time. It means you don't have to call a different server every time you want to do something with authentication. But it did mean that we couldn't use most of our authentication code. I'd also never really considered myself, when I joined Zappi, I came straight out of academia. And so I had never, before touching Elixir, worried about anything authentication or authorization. I'd never had to look at it. It was there. I did a magical include whatever module name in my controller, and all this stuff happened. In addition to that, we also had OpsBox, which was kind of a utility gem, primarily focused on observability, so metrics. We used Influx and Grafana, logs, tracing, all of that great debugging stuff. We also have like a custom event capturing library called Hoodie, which just publishes out a message so that our BI team can stop complaining at us. But there's more. I mentioned that we built a asynchronous messaging gem, and technically it's actually two. One to run a tiny little application on a dedicated pod, which polls and handles the messages. And then there was another which housed our pretty big library right now of protobuf schemas, which is what we use to encode and decode the messages. And on that topic of communication, we also had a gem which just facilitated good old HTTP synchronous requests. It was kind of a mix of standardization and documentation. But yeah, so we had that too. And then there's the odd bit and piece strewn around the GitHub organization. But those are the most important ones. So now, this looked like a big blocker. How much time and effort had gone into building and maintaining those libraries? There was years. User management connector is 6 years old. The Zappi messages gem is 3 years old. And they've been all maintained this whole time. So how could we reproduce that with a team of 2 backenders and 1 frontender? So my solution, I use the same solution I do for many, many problems, and that's to ignore it while it wasn't a problem yet. We shunted it down the line and decided when the time comes, we'll tackle it. Unfortunately, the time for authentication is always now. That's something we had to do right up front. We did have the whole one login XML stuff, which we copied over, but more importantly, we needed something for our React front end. So I had to learn about cores and JWT and all that stuff, and it turned out to be surprisingly simple, at least the core features, right? You get something in a cookie or the header, and you have a secret key in your environment, and then you authenticate someone. It's really not that bad. Maybe it took a little longer than spinning up a Rails microservice, but I mean, once done, it's there. So we're confident enough in our app security now that we think we're going to pass the upcoming pen tests. I mean, we are going to pass the upcoming pen test. That's, just have to be confident. Next up was permissions. As my team pretty much was just rewriting the visualization presentation part of the platform, we still hook into the old kind of calculation engine, for lack of a better term. And so we just worked around permissions. We worked around authorization. We said, okay, we're already pointing to that service. Why not for now just point to them and use that information? It worked for a little bit, but it scaled poorly in terms of performance. So eventually we did need to do the thing. And it turns out, because we are now a few years down the line, our APIs have grown and matured. And there was a couple years ago, I think one of the teams made a big push towards API documentation using OpenAPI, and we've got a Swagger interface and everything. And it turns out when you've got a good API and good documentation, you don't need a gem, you don't need a package. You can use whatever HTTP client you feel like using. It's an HTTP request. It's easy, right? So that's what we did. We just grabbed stuff via API. And kind of what we found is that when you're building good applications, good APIs, you just really don't need to have very complicated connectors. And most of that complexity is likely driven by a single domain somewhere that needed some functionality. And it was thrown into a gem to be reusable, kind of just in case. So last among those internal dependencies was this asynchronous messaging gem. It was a really cool project, tricky to build, and was my baby for a little bit before handing it over to another team to maintain. It was in Ruby, so the majority of the complexity was because we couldn't just write code. We had to rely on Docker and Kubernetes configurations and SRE and hosting the thing in a separate application, basically. And you've got your app and the main app, and that's duplicated for every app that is running that wants to use a message queue. So, yeah. It was a fun project, fascinating, but in Elixir we used Broadway. It took one developer a week with testing, and there we were, right? So now, I haven't touched yet on OpsBox, because while OpsBox is an internal thing at Zappi, Zexbox, its replacement, is now open source. It's not very good. We are still battle testing it, but we decided, the reason we open sourced it really is because development outstripped bureaucracy. We had some kind of event and metric capturing stuff early on, because again, it's easy. It's just writing to a database most of the time. But by this time, there was a second team joining our little Elixir cult, and they were rebuilding the calculation engine, the data platform. But we still didn't have a private organization on Hex. So we got sick of waiting around. The other team lead and myself decided, screw it, and we open sourced it. It was awesome. It's not what we'd call done at the moment, but the intent there is to provide kind of a one-stop observability shop. Simplified APIs compared to the other open source things with obviously kind of a standardization. So if you're spinning out something new and just want a nice package with everything observability, that's what the intent is behind Zexbox. But it's not just, when moving to a new language like Elixir, it's not just internal dependencies you have to think about, it is external dependencies. I would like to say that Elixir and Ruby are differently mature. They kind of have different focuses, but there were some things that we missed. And one of my colleagues is working on a package called Saga Weaver. I'm going to read this word for word. It manages distributed message orchestration. I'm not going to pretend that I know exactly what or how it works, but he's putting a lot of time into it, and more importantly, he's really, really passionate about this. I myself have built a package called SwagDocs, which is an open API documentation tool, and there are a bunch out there, but a lot of them feel kind of invasive. They use metaprogramming, and they feel like they are just taking up a lot of your code space. I took inspiration from SwaggerYard in Ruby, which generates API schemas from your documentation or from code comments. And I thought we can do the same. So SwagDocs, in the next slide you'll see, it allows you to define APIs within your actual function docs and module docs as well. The intent being that documentation should not look like code because it's documentation. That was not intended. Anyway, so the biggest question we originally had to answer was, were we going to be slowed down? And I don't think we were. I've built new apps in Rails with our existing tools, and there's always something, right? There's always something, maybe you're on a new Ruby version, and something doesn't quite work exactly as intended. So there's always some challenge that you have to tackle. And at some point, the layers and layers and layers of abstraction honestly just feel like they make you a less well-rounded developer. So then what are the benefits? I think there's many. Deeper understanding of how applications actually work, as well as a broader understanding of all the things surrounding an app that needs to be put in place. The auth, the observability. Junior devs start off with more solid fundamentals, and senior devs just get excited to give back to the community. I've seen so much passion from our devs who've moved to working with Elixir, and it's great. It's intoxicating. We've ended up building what we consider the world's most advanced AI-powered market researcher, and I can't imagine having done it in anything except Elixir. Now look at this magnificent invention. So these are examples of what's called Rouleau triangles, and my background is mechanical engineering, so I get very excited by these. Rouleau shapes have a constant diameter like a circle, but they're obviously not circles. So they work perfectly fine as wheels, as long as you're happy kind of bouncing up and down as your center of gravity changes. The video of this is great. You should check it out. So if humanity never reinvented that wheel, this pinnacle of human innovation would never exist. So don't let something silly like it's a lot of work stop you from trying something new. As Shia LaBeouf would say, just do it. And there we go.
All right, thank you very much. So I don't have any time left, but definitely ask questions on Hoover. And yeah, thank you. In about 5 minutes, we're going to come back for our last talk of track 1. So thanks again.
Thanks, guys.